Hi, Dave. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Adam. How are you today?
Actually, perfect. Almost a little bit too late because there were the Airhacks TV show. So, and I get so many questions that I had to almost stop this. So it was today was crazy. It was like 2 minutes, and now I switch the gear, and now we are talking.
All right. I hope it was worth it.
Uh, of course, because what I would like to know is what was your first computer?
All right. So I've got a couple of answers for this one.
Yeah.
I think the first computer that I had experience with or experienced as a kid was a PDP-8 with a paper tape reader, sitting in my father's office. He was a physical chemistry professor, and I had a listing like a text-based adventure game listing that I wanted to type in to this. I think it was in BASIC and get it working. So of course this became my first experience with debugging, and I don't think we ever got the full thing working. But then the first computer that I had at home was a TRS-80 Model 1. Had
But the
access to that
tape
every day.
reader, how you were able to program that? So it was like a printer, right?
As
It
I
printed the
don't really
tapes.
remember exactly how things worked back then. This is a long time ago, but I believe that the paper tape was basically for recording, basically printing out the code that I'd typed in.
And there were
Right.
holes inside, right? I also remember because I got, the tapes from someone, but I didn't have the computer. But I was fascinated that it was created by computer. There were a patterns of holes inside a tape. And and I was fascinated by that, I
Yeah.
remember. I had no idea which computer it was. So you created the holes?
I really don't remember how that part worked. I think that was after you typed the thing into memory, then you wanted to be able to save it so that you could then
Yeah.
load it again later.
Okay. It would be actually interesting to see the machine which reads that, right? So because was like there should be mechanical device. It's like, almost like a data set in Commodore 64.
Yeah.
Yeah. I will do some research because as you say this, I remember exactly the tapes, but I never saw how they are read or created actually.
Yeah, I just had this memory a couple of weeks ago, and I was asking my dad about it, what computer it probably was, and he thinks it was probably a PDP-8 in his office.
It was also interesting how fast the tape was printed, right? If you imagine, because it has to rotate, I don't know how many meters per second or whatever. Interesting. And TRS, okay. So what you did with the TRS then?
I think the back then was just video games. There were actually some. I think we didn't have a hard disk, so you had to load things in using cassette tape.
Exactly.
And there were some primitive games back then. There was one called Death Maze 5000. It was kind of a perspective view. You're going down a hallway, and you can turn right, and you can turn left, and you have to find your way through this maze. And there's some various traps that can kill you along the way. I also remember there was like a primitive version of Asteroids that ran on the TRS-80, and it didn't look very good because TRS-80, like the pixels were rectangular. It was something like 127 by 48 resolution, something like that. But there were some games on there, and I remember learning about peek and poke and trying to kind of work around like the copy protection on some programs. Like it seems like some programs had a way to ask you a password or something like that, or a license code, and there was a way to kind of figure out if you looked at the bytes in memory, you could kind of figure out, oh, if I jump to this location, I can like bypass the password prompt, and I can run the program.
You said asteroids were primitive, but I remember there were the origin asteroids. It was in the how it's called gaming halls, where the proper machines, not computers, rather how it's called properly. Arcades, exactly.
A video game
and
an arcade.
The place, the location where
Yeah.
is arcade. You just call it arcade, right? So
Right. And
exactly.
the Asteroids game that was in the arcades had vector graphics.
Yeah, but it
looked really
was
cool.
it was just
it wasn't
it was
pixelated,
just the border. It
vector.
was just white line, and there was a small rockets which you can control. But it
Right.
was also there was actually
Yeah.
at the same time there were other arcade machines which looked beautiful. It was in color, and the asteroids always looked primitive actually.
Yeah. There was also Battlezone, which had that same kind of vector graphics look, where you're driving a tank around.
Yeah,
There
there was
cool
another
games like Defender
another
that were really
game
cool and have
where
lots
there
of
was like
colors and cool
an
graphics.
airplane. You can fly left and right, and it was also like just a few lines. But it was interesting right now because it say as I remember the asteroids in arcade and the I don't know what was the other one, and the other games were already proper games. They look like C64, but asteroid and the other was completely different and still very popular. Interestingly. On the table, there's also the the Defender, right? Game, where yeah, cool. And you play everything on TRS or also arcade?
Back then, in those days, I used to go to video game arcades. There was like one on the main street in my town that was very popular. It was like a hangout location.
And when you got the the interest to write code,
so I guess I was interested in that from the start, and maybe the first like Dungeons and Dragons character generators, things like that. But I actually got a job at the University of North Carolina in the physiology department. My mother was a programmer working there, and she hooked me up with a job, a summer job.
Which programming language she wrote?
Back then she was doing C.
Wow.
I believe. She was actually working on her master's degree in computer science, and she would receive that in 1980, which was the first year that University of North Carolina actually did a master's degree program. So I had lots of interest in computers based on her work and my father's work. He used a lot of computers in his physical chemistry lab. But I got this job, and initially it was doing things like helping scientists deal with kind of early spreadsheet programs, like VisiCalc was one of them. But eventually it led into writing C code to control kind of laboratory equipment using like A to D, digital to analog and analog to digital converters, and eventually into things like early image capture boards, like being able to bring images into the computer for analysis. So I was very interested early on in computer graphics, and I was majoring in computer science during these years, and I guess my favorite classes were like the two computer graphics classes, 461 and 462. I really love those classes, and when I went to look for a job after college, that's what I was looking for. I was looking in the newspapers for anything that said computer graphics or image processing.
So, as a kid, you just played games, but then you wanted to have a job, so you apply, and then you work, and you had then to program something, right? This was the trajectory to programming, or?
Yeah, I think it was a trajectory. Yeah, it was video games, and I guess I had an interest in doing video games, but there was no, I couldn't get a job doing video games that easily, and I guess I didn't have the imagination to come up with my own video game. So yeah, it became a job and a way to make money. So I did those summer jobs, and I actually did some.
But how you could do something, productive without knowing programming? I mean,
well, I had people who were there to teach me. Yeah, I had some mentors, the professors there, and I had just a strong interest in learning, for example, C, because that was
so if you have interest into it, there's no problem.
Everybody was using in the lab.
After a few weeks, something already is working usually, and then
Yeah, and I think in my computer science program, they didn't actually teach you programming. There was no class on how to write C. You just kind of jump into algorithms and data structures, and they kind of expect you to pick up the programming language. Maybe there was a class on C programming, but I don't think you got any credits for taking it.
This was the transition to, there was from nothing to studying computer science, right?
I mean, when I initially applied to college, I thought I wanted to be an architect and go into like designing buildings. And I got into the School of Design, but I still had this interest in computers in the background. And then I retook one of the standardized tests, called the SAT test, and I greatly increased my score to the point where I could get into computer science program.
Okay.
And so I decided to do that.
Okay. And which programming languages you learned during your time at the university?
I think it was almost all C. Oh, okay. No, that's not true. The initial classes were in Pascal. We had a UCSD P system, 68,000 based computers. So lots of Pascal early on, and then C, and I don't think any other languages except like in programming languages class. We looked at other languages like Lisp I remember using my Commodore 64 to run Logo and do a kind of paper about the Logo programming language.
Okay, Logo is fun.
Or programming language. Yeah, you mentioned that on a previous episode. That was a fun language.
So you had computers. You had the PDP-8, then TRS-80, and then C64.
Yeah, I took a C64 with me off
Okay.
to college. I wasn't able to use it for much programming because everything that we did was on computers kind of provided by the university. Like there was a Data General MV8000 Eclipse machine, and they had everybody kind of using that.
What's the name? Never heard about
terminals. That. It's Data General MV8000, and it's kind of a classic machine. There's actually a book about the development of the machine.
Okay.
About the development of that machine and its operating system.
Interesting, but it was not really successful, right?
I think it was pretty successful. It was not successful at our school because we had so many people using this one machine. It was like a time-sharing machine. It had all these it had way too many terminals hooked up to it. So I can remember literally sleeping on the floor of like the computer building, waiting for a time at a terminal. And then once you get a terminal, you type in a line of code and press enter, and you just kind of wait.
Okay.
And wait.
There's a queuing already, right? Okay. Yes. What happens after the university?
Yeah, so after university, I was really interested in computer graphics, and like I said, I was looking in newspapers around the Raleigh, North Carolina area, and also in Washington D.C. because I was interested in that area for some reason. And I eventually found a job at a little defense contracting company that did they did two things. They did video tracking for basically missiles or things in the sky for the defense industry. Okay. But they also did photogrammetry, which is kind of the science of measuring the Earth. And it's used for things like mapping satellite photographs to maps so that you can overlay them on maps, and other things like that. And I actually was involved in a very interesting project initially when I first started my job, right after college, actually at the FBI building. And it was in the special photography unit. And they had this project that used photogrammetry to try to analyze pictures of bank robberies. So they'd have a picture of a bank robbery taken by, the camera in the bank. And then they would have an agent go in with a digitizing tablet and kind of identify points that define the perspective, so different points on the counter, these lines, and was supposedly able to calculate the height or the approximate height of the bank robber.
Ah, interesting.
that was an interesting application. But after that, the thing that really kind of changed my career was that I got into geographic information systems and mapping. And this company I was working for was a defense contractor, but they had a contract to basically support this open source software called GRASS.
Maybe I have a related story to this, before pandemic, what I did, I organized from time to time workshops at Munich Airport, and there was a woman from Netherlands, and it turned out, I think what happens is she worked actually for Greenland, and what she did, the problem with Greenland was there was no algorithm, how to call it, to because the Earth is more or less a sphere. But in Switzerland there are mountains, and in Netherlands is flat, and Greenland is something in between, and they had no algorithm to map the map to the Earth, and she did it, and we had a chat, and she said, okay, there's no problem, it's just math, but this was mind blowing what she did. She actually implemented the algorithm for Greenland for Netherlands. And I think there's a similar algorithm we mentioned right now, right? And she was really nice. And she attended several times. They were like, I was really stunned because she attended my Java E workshops. And she was like, why are you attending, my boring stuff if you know how to map, the Greenland to a map. But I think there's a similar algorithm, right? What she did.
Yeah, I think what she did was probably develop a map projection.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
A map projection is a way to project the sphere onto a flat surface.
Exactly.
And there are a bunch of different map projections, and I guess none of them were really very good for Greenland.
Exactly. This is what she did. And what was your algorithm?
Yeah, I don't know what the algorithms used there are. This was a system that I kind of got thrown into supporting. It was what was called an expert system at the time. So it's a whole bunch of kind of if then else.
Yeah, sure.
That,
No.
that
But what I said is this is interesting. This is a similar problem, to map a 3D object to a flat surface.
Right.
What happened then? So after your bank robbery system, bank robbery, not prevention, not even prevention. How to call it? Resolution, right?
Right. Find the bank robber. So what I got into next was this software called GRASS. So it's the Geographical Resources Analysis Support System. And it was open source software kind of before anything was called open source. And this system was a raster-based geographic information system. And raster means that like each map layer is essentially a grid of numeric values. And you might have a map layer that's for soil, where the numbers are like 1 for clay and 2 for sandy and 3 for loam, etc. Or you might have a map that's elevation map, so that's kind of the land elevation at each point. And then you can do kind of map combinations. You can add maps together, multiply them together, kind of do mathematics. So for example, if you have an elevation map, then you can derive a slope map. Or you can do kind of logic, like you're looking for high elevation areas that have clay, for example. So I kind of became an expert in this software, and we had
more like layers.
Exactly.
So you could have layers and combine them.
So you have multiple layers, and then ways to kind of combine them and derive new map layers based on those things. So we had a contract with the Army Corps of Engineers to add new features to this software. And we also distributed the software. So people would order the software from us. We would send them a tape with the software on it and a copy of the manual.
Which programming language was it?
This was all in C.
Okay.
It all ran on Unix and specifically Sun OS. So we would also sell turnkey systems. So if a customer wanted, we would basically install the GRASS software onto a Sun workstation. We would hook up a digitizing tablet, this large table size thing that you could strap a map to and digitize, and then maybe a thermal wax printer. Tektronix sold these thermal wax color printers that worked well with GRASS. And so we would sell these systems. And at one point, I sold a system to University of West Indies in Kingston, Jamaica.
Okay.
And actually ended up going down. They wanted someone to come down and install the system and train them how to use it. So I went down there, trained them how to use it, and they offered me a job.
Okay.
And so that kind of changed my life at that point. Like I went back home and I was like ready to go. But I had a girlfriend at the time, and she was actually working with me at the very same company on GRASS. And we decided that we wanted to go. And in order to go, we had to get married. And so we did that, moved to Jamaica, and we're still together to this day.
In Jamaica?
That was no, we just went back there last week to visit, but yeah, we went there for like a year and a half, and I worked for the university and continued to evolve or to contribute to the GRASS software and do training classes and things like that. So that was kind of an example where some open source software kind of changed my life, kind of like happened later on with Roller.
And I think even your music tastes for sure as well, right?
About moving down there. I'd always been a fan of Jamaica and reggae music.
Roots reggae, right? So the
Yep.
Nice rhythm. By the way, I was at Java 1, and I don't know why. Once the technician asked me, "Do I have music with me?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Then they can just play it." And then I played some reggae before my session. This is why I don't know what was it like a roots. This was like something from Bob Marley or whatever, and everyone was was perplexed. What happens right now? It's like, okay, don't worry, it was just fun. And okay, so I didn't know that. So you spent a lot of time in Jamaica.
Yeah, I spent about a year and a half there, actually.
Okay, and working on GRASS. Is GRASS still around?
It actually is still around. I was just poking around, and I noticed that they have versions of it now with a nice user interface that runs on Mac and Windows and and Linux.
Same purpose.
As
So
well.
it's still, having layers and combined layers.
Yes,
What
it's
is actually
still-
the killer use case for Grass?
Gosh, I'm not sure. I guess and maybe environmental monitoring is one of the things they
Okay.
use it for. So, I mean, the most popular geographic information system software these days is by ESRI, Environmental Systems Research Institute. It's called ArcGIS. And it's really a vector-based system. Everything is line segments, and each line segment ties into maybe a database record. And it's very good for things like keeping track of property records in a town, or the utilities that are laid out through a town. I think Grass is maybe more suited for kind of environmental things, and not necessarily like local government kind of applications. It's more of a science-oriented geographic information system, I think.
I was involved a little bit in two systems which were similar to this. One was analyzing satellite images for the farmers, where how much fertilizer they spread somewhere, and what was the vegetation, what was the impact of the fertilizer on the plants. And this was one, and the other one with layers. This was one of my first projects, was actually for power plants. So they all, the pipes and the cable routing, and there were layers on top of, on different maps. So there was the first map, and there was the next layer and layer, and they can first, in this in this location there is some problem, and they could send technician, and they could activate and deactivate the layers. They talked about layers back then. So this is why I'm asking. And what's also interesting, it also ran on SunOS, but then we make it to run on the IBM ThinkPads actually, and it worked fairly well. So there was I think an OpenGL back then. And what also cool, the entire system, I think they called it graphic atoms. And we rerouted. Those are huge display panels, I remember. And there was a driver, and the driver was for the distribution of the graphic atoms to the displays, which are the entire wall. And what we did, we re-implemented this on Java applet. So actually, you could see whatever was on the wall also inside a Java applet and a Swing app, which was crazy, and yeah, everyone was delighted back then, and the developers as well, because they wanted to learn Java. They only knew C and Visual Basic, and for them it's not a completely new world. So everyone was highly motivated. It was a nice project.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that computer mapping and GIS stuff was kind of a big part of my life for kind of the first half of my career. So
okay. And you spent 1.5 years in Jamaica just with Grass.
Yeah.
Okay. And what happens afterwards? Why you left Jamaica? So you didn't like the music anymore, or
I basically couldn't get them to extend my contract any further. I would have stayed if I could have. So I came back to the U.S. and kept on trying to work in the computer mapping field. I ended up with the phone company, essentially. The phone company for the New York and New England areas called 9X. They had a research lab. I guess it had broken off from Bell Labs, and they were doing interesting stuff with geographic information systems there. I worked on a system to allow kind of cable TV engineers to lay out their cabling throughout a neighborhood and test signal strength. And this was all based on essentially AutoCAD with C++ additions that we wrote that kind of tied things in the drawing into a database so that we can enable these kind of calculations. So that at 9X I kind of got into C++ programming, and also doing a fair amount of Windows programming with Win32 and the Microsoft Foundation classes and this kind of thing. And it was around that time that I first got introduced to Java. This is like 96. Java was not quite ready for a 1.0 release. But since we were a pretty big Sun customer at 9X, they sent a team of folks to actually train us in Java.
Okay.
And so I got trained kind of early on in Java. And I didn't get to work with Java for a year or two after that. But I just remember being kind of blown away by by the technology.
I really like that.
And
So this is interesting because I would assume, if someone back then knew C, C++ really well, and the Java comes, which was primitive, the first version was not, impressive at all. And everyone liked that. This was actually interesting.
yeah, I mean, I guess the syntax was very familiar for a C programmer. But also all the libraries seemed very impressive to me, and having this all in one package, and also the promise of being able to run things like in a web browser. That was kind of mind-blowing at the time.
And you didn't use Java for 2 more years, you said?
Yeah, I didn't actually start using Java until I left the phone company. At some point, I'd been working in GIS, and I'd been working at this phone company for a while, and I kind of decided that I wanted to work for a company that just did software, a company where the software wasn't considered like a cost of doing business, but the software was really like the thing that they're making money off. And so I decided to leave 9X and started looking for a job. I did look at a couple of software companies that did GIS, but I ended up joining a company called Rouge Wave, which was very popular at the time because they
collection framework, right?
They had the most popular C++ libraries, tools.h++, and dbtools.h++, which is like cross database stuff. But actually, I was working on a small team on a framework they had called Zap. So Rouge Wave had bought a company called Nmark, and they had a cross-platform GUI framework called Zap. So you can write kind of a very beautiful GUI, and it will run on X Windows, or it will run on Windows or OS2. And the project that I was working on was a GUI builder for Zap. Okay. So it would generate kind of a complete GUI for you in C++ that used the Zap libraries. And then eventually we turned that into jfactory, which was one of the very earliest kind of Java development environments. So instead of it's the very same Zap application, but instead of generating C++ code that called Zap, it would generate Java code that called back then it was AWT, I believe.
But the GUI builder was written in C++, I assume, right?
Right. That's right.
Interesting. What I think Rouge Wave, I remember, was one of the collection providers for Java before collection were available in Java, right?
That's right. There was, I think it was called JBeans, maybe?
Because I evaluated, so the story was, in Java we had dictionary, hash table, and vector. I think that's basically was JDK 1.0. And I think with JDK 1.2, the collection framework came out. And I had to evaluate the collection frameworks between, 1.0 and 1.2, Java 2 or 1.2. So it was like, 3 years and span, and the companies wanted to know. So I think Rouge Wave was one provider, and there were 2 others. I forgot actually the names. I would have to do some research. What were the names of the other collection providers? So, the young Java users don't remember, but at the beginning there was no list, there was no IRA list, no hash map. There was just hash table, dictionary, and the vector. This is what we had. And Rouge Wave provided one, I think, a collection framework for Java, and there was I actually at the beginning of Java I always had to evaluate. Right, one evaluation was the collection frameworks. The other one was then object-oriented databases were huge in Java. Everyone wanted to have one, right? There was the Echelon and Object Space and all the others, and later was the persistence framework. I had to evaluate for companies, whether they top link or hibernate, then Eclipse link, always evaluation. So, and now everything, no one cares anymore. We can use whatever we like. So, but at the beginning was just discussion and evaluation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
jfactory, was it successful?
I would say no, not really. Not really. It wasn't especially successful. Otherwise,
why not? But because the beginning everything was successful in Java, right? So everyone bought everything, I would say.
Yeah, I think there were the competitors back then. There was like Visual Age, was one of them. There was JBuilder, and they were really complete Java IDEs. I mean, this was really just the GUI builder.
Okay.
It didn't have the full IDE, and I don't think I think people want the full IDE experience. They don't want.
But what happens to Rouge Wave? I mean, because it was still around. I think as the name came, over and over again. So I think what happens to them? You know it?
I'm not really sure what happened to them. I know it seems like they were purchased by some company that specialized in maybe healthcare technologies or something.
Okay.
So I'm not really sure what's going on with them now. I haven't looked them up
Okay.
in a couple of years.
But with the JFactory, you did the JFactory thing.
I worked on that project. I didn't develop that.
No, but you were one of the developers
Yeah.
who created the JFactory. So it was a larger project, right?
Yes, it was a larger project, and we were doing a lot of work to try to move towards Java and actually we're doing some work to replace JFactory itself with something that's pure Java.
Okay.
And I think around that, it was like around, I've been at maybe there for 3 years or so, and they decided to shut down their office in Charlotte. And I was one of 2 developers in that office, so I got laid off. That was my first experience with getting laid off. I ended up working some other job in Charlotte doing like Swing development, and eventually moved back to Raleigh, North Carolina, where I am now. And I got a job with a pretty interesting startup called Hot Software. And it was Hot, HAHT, and they had a product called Hot Site. And maybe you remember back in the 90s, there were these WYSIWYG HTML builders, like Front Page.
Yeah.
There was one, I can't remember the
Hot Metal.
Yes, Hot Metal. And so Hot Site, they had this very nice GUI builder, HTML builder. But they also had a back end, like with Front Page, you develop your site and then you'd use FTP to copy it up to a server. But Hot Site actually had a complete application server, a distributed application server, quite advanced for the time. But the thing is, it ran BASIC. So it was like a distributed BASIC application server. So it used this engine called Summit BASIC.
Cold Fusion was also big back then, I remember. Remember Cold Fusion? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that was definitely a competitor. And so I worked on this. I think the reason they hired me was because I had all that C++ experience. I had experience with DB tools ++, across the database library. But eventually at that company, got into trying to change that app server so that it would be a Java-based app server. So, replace the Summit engine with the JVM, replace the page rendering technology with the Catalina engine from Tomcat.
Okay.
And we really wanted to make a complete J2EE app server. So we also licensed an EJB container from Enprise, that's Borland's enterprise branch. And that also included a JMS implementation. So we really wanted to create a complete app server. And this is kind of the origin of Roller, is that I was working on this app server, and I really wanted to kind of dog food it and understand what it's like to develop an app for this thing, with EJBs and all of that. And so I started working on something that eventually became a blog server and eventually became Roller, to basically be kind of that, that dog fooding application. But eventually, I started using technologies like xDoclet to generate the EJB stuff. And I started noticing it was really a pain. So like when I was trying to do development, to kind of wait for the EJB container to start up, and it was just a lot of overhead doing EJBs.
You had your own. You had your own container.
Yeah.
You built your own, or you bought one.
So we licensed the Borland. Enprise EJB container and integrated it into our app server. But eventually I got tired of kind of messing around with EJBs and got much more interested in actually building a blog server. And around that time, I was just fascinated with the number of open source components that are just freely available for developers to use, from things like the Tomcat engine to Ant, to NetBeans, to xDoclet. And I think Castor was what I was using for persistence back then.
Exactly, Castor.
And I became fascinated with all those things. I realized I could build a blog server and it could have like a templating engine behind it. And I kind of got into doing that kind of nights and weekends for quite a while. And eventually realized that the code base, because I was kind of doing it for work, maybe the code base is kind of owned by my employer. And so I decided that I wanted to change that, and I wanted to make it open source. So I appealed to my manager to kind of let me write a magazine article about this blog server and to open source the code as part of that. So that's kind of what happened to get Roller out into the world.
I didn't knew that. I thought that you are working for Sun Microsystems.
No, this is before Sun Microsystems. So shortly after I released that magazine article, maybe 2 months, somebody, I think his name was Anthony Eden, decided to start running Roller. He created a site called Free Roller, and he started to get a huge number of people to sign up for that. And I thought he was crazy at the time because the thing had, the software had many bugs in it and had lots of problems. Like, for example, I was storing passwords in plain text in the database, things like that. But actually, Sun noticed that Free Roller had thousands of users, and when they were looking to set up their employee blogs, they decided to go with Roller.
And this is what I saw. At Java.net, I think. This was the decision that Sun would use Roller for all the internal websites. And there was maybe interview with you, and I found this fascinating actually back then. So it is really, really interesting.
Yeah, it was actually they decided to use it for their public external website. They wanted all of their employees to be able to blog, and really about any topic. They didn't want to restrict them to just blogging about Sun or blogging about Java. They wanted to kind of blog about whatever they wanted. And they kind of hoped that most people would probably end up blogging about their job and promoting their work. And that's kind of what happened, I think.
It was actually a huge success story, I would say, with the blogging and Sun. What I'm doing right now, I try to find my very first post. Why blogging was actually the story was, I really liked the Blogger software. So I have no idea why I should blog, but I would like to try this software out. So this was actually my idea, and I had my own server. So I go, let's install the Apache Roller and see what happens. And this is how I started. And what I noticed back then, I remember this still, how well the installation process worked actually. It was, as I remember, I didn't have to configure anything. I could just run it, and he asked me, which database would you like to use? It was like almost like a wizard back then, which was not usual. Usually you will have to, write lots of XML to achieve anything, and it just worked. And and I'm already here. This is in 2007. And this points to my very first blog, but I couldn't find it right now. So I think I started in 2006 was my very first blog post with the Apache Roller. And and then I just documented, whatever I did, and was a nice experience as well. But you ever worked for Sun Microsystems?
Yeah. So once Sun started using Roller for their external blogs, I contacted, I guess it was Tim Bray about that, and was basically asking them if they need any help because Roller was badly broken. I thought I knew they were going to have problems with it. There were lots of features that it was lacking, and so I was able to get a job with the Sun web engineering team that was actually running blogs.sun.com. Okay. And so we worked on a bunch of different Roller enhancements over the years, and we also took Roller to the Apache Software Foundation, got it through the incubation process, etc. I worked for Sun for almost 5 years on Roller and kind of related technologies.
What interests me right now is how big was the traffic? How many transactions per second or requests per second, was back then? Because the entire Sun, company ran on Roller, right?
That's right. So I think there were tens of thousands of blogs. I don't actually know I can't give you any traffic numbers.
It's a pity because this was really interesting. This would interest me because I remember you even blogged about the cache as well, right? So how to improve the scalability. So I don't know, for a strange reason, I remember actually some articles from you.
Yeah, I think in the early days first there was Free Roller, run by Anthony Eden, and then the Java lobby picked up, kind of took over Free Roller, and we're running something called JRoller. And I was actually, the Java lobby folks, Rick Ross and Matt Schmidt, are over in Cary, about 30 miles away from me. And so we were actually working together to try to keep that site up and running. There were lots of scalability problems, I remember, in the early days. And I can't remember if that's when we put in the caching. I think it was around that time that I decided to move from Castor JDO to Hibernate. We were having all kinds of performance problems, and that was kind of a shot in the dark. Maybe that was silly to expect that to change anything. but yeah, page caching was always an important part of making sure a roller system can stay up. So every page that we render is cached, and I think we had a pluggable memcache implementation. And then the RSS feeds are also cached.
My very first post was 2006 in July. I think I installed roller done, I would assume, in May 2006. So it was pretty late already, right? I think when you started at Sun with your roller adventure?
2004, I think.
Yeah, that's okay. I would say then I take a look at 1 year at achievements, and then that's okay. Then let's go and do it. And what's interesting is how it's called pingback. Pingback, right? Back then there was a system where you wrote a comment. You could how it worked. This was the reason why XML RPC was actually so popular in the block engines, because it was like a callback, right? You could write a comment in someone else's blog, I think.
That's right.
And refer your own posts. This was called pingback, but this was also source of spam, and then was deactivated.
That's right. Yeah, I remember there was an implementation of pingback in Roller, and it would enable you to kind of add comments to an existing post from some other blog. But it's definitely something that could easily be abused.
Mm-hmm. And and then I got also high traffic on my side, but I said, okay, it looks like someone would like to spam me. And I said, okay, then I would like to write analytics. And I took a look at your code, and I assumed Sun Microsystems, you're using Java 6. But you used an older Spring version with Hibernate, which was not compatible with Glassfish, what I use, because the Glassfish was newer than your code. And this was the start of microservices. Then I said, okay, I'm not able to extend Roller, so instead of that, I would write an interceptor and ping another microservice. I call that X-Ray, and the other microservice will use EJBs, actually, the proper one, because they start faster. This was interesting observation, but this was new at Java E. With the Glassfish, it was newer. There was no XML, nothing, no Xdoclet. It was just one annotation. And I wrote entire system called X-Ray, which for analytics still on my blog. So the on the right side, all the numbers come from the X-Ray system. And I only used the one, I think was called Page Model from you. This was like a plugin, which called the X-Ray and it was also a cache and used the recent statistics. And the cool story is I'm a consultant, so I cannot reveal my client's code, but the X-Ray was somehow big, so I used it to explain some patterns. It was actually a cool idea. And I actually wrote a book about that as well, and James Gosling wrote a forward for that. So this was actually and then you asked me once, I don't know, 5 years ago, whether I can, write something to the Apache roller or like a reference, which is also funny because actually you wrote the roller. And but what I always was pleasantly surprised about, the at the beginning, for instance, I use always the internal editor in Roller. So this is it worked really well. And I think in 2006 we had a WYSIWYG editor. What you see is what you get inside, the Roller, which was, you wrote everything. So you were in charge, of the internal how to call it, admin pages.
Yeah.
But this was crazy back then. This was like cutting edge.
Well, I didn't write any WYSIWYG editor.
No, but you included. I know you included the external components, but everything worked together, and it was very usable.
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm very glad to hear that. I guess I maybe didn't have that experience with the WYSIWYG editors. I always had a hard time with them, and I think generally I would default to writing the HTML by hand. Yeah,
I also wrote the HTML by hand, but the editor inside in Roller, it was like you could use the how to call it, the what you see is what you get feature. I always actually wrote HTML plain, but the page templates and the possibility to have the Dave wrapper, and you have the header and the footer and the content and the slots. So it was actually very usable, and it was Velocity, right? It is based on
Yeah.
Velocity template engine, I think.
Yep, it still is based on Velocity. Although I think Velocity is in the attic right now. It's like a retired project.
Yeah, which is funny because I think Velocity is also used in lots of serverless projects on AWS. It's the same syntax. So if you use, API gateway or whatever, it's the Velocity syntax, which is cutting edge in serverless, and we used that, in Blogger 17 years ago. Because I saw there's like the syntax is Velocity, and all the serverless people were excited about the template engine. It was okay. And it is already in the attic, in Apache attic, yeah.
I'm surprised. I thought there were other templating languages that were much more popular nowadays.
FreeMarker, for instance. No, and no one says this is Velocity. It is just used. The syntax is used, and it leaks a little bit. Someone admitted it's Velocity, but this is just the dollar dot or whatever is just the
right.
typical syntax. And this. How long you maintained the roller at Sun? 5 years, you said?
Yeah, I worked at Sun until early 2009 when I got hit by a layoff caused by the global financial crisis of 2008. So I did that, but I've continued to kind of contribute to the project and kind of act as the project management chair over the years. Mm-hmm. We're still going. We're still able to put out releases. Mm-hmm. Your brother is a contributor who's done some awesome stuff to keep dependencies up to date. Mm-hmm. And I'm just kind of hanging around there because if I'm there, that enables other people to possibly work on the project. If I were to leave, you really need to have 3 people to kind of keep an Apache project alive. If you don't have the 3 people you need to vote out a release, you really need to kind of retire the project. So we've got enough people now that when it's time to make a release for whatever reason, like if there's some security vulnerability, we can actually do it.
So the requirement for Apache is to have 3 PMs?
Yes, or basically 3 people who can vote out a release. 3 POC members, yeah.
Less than then you have to close the project?
Basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I think 1 person would be enough. But this is hard stuff. This is actually the reason why there are so many projects in the attic, maybe, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so what happened to you after Sun Microsystems? So what's interesting? I thought there's a complete different story behind it. What I thought is you were always a Sun employee, and then Roller happened. This was the other way around. Because of Roller, you became Sun employee.
Yep, that's
right.
But
you had a rockstar status inside for at least at the beginning, no?
I guess.
Yeah, yeah, of course. So what I read was a crazy stuff. It was okay, this is really cool, and for me it was like this role come from nowhere. So I would say this was great ride. Have you also attended Java once?
Yeah, I attended when I worked for Sun. I think I went almost every year that I was there. I figured out how to make a talk out of various things. I got into doing RSS and Atom and following along with the development of the Atom protocol. And I wrote a book about RSS and Atom, and so I gave some talks at Java 1 about that topic, and about the programming library Rome, which does RSS and Atom. And then towards the end of my stay at Sun, I moved from the Sun Web Engineering Group into the Glassfish team, and we were working on a social software suite. So we wanted to package together Roller and some wiki software and a link sharing service. And eventually we changed that into an open social server at some point.
Okay.
Called Project Social Site. So my last couple of years at Sun, we're kind of trying to expand beyond Roller and into creating kind of a social software suite for Sun. And
now it would be very successful, right? If there would be relaunch right now, it would be actually interesting story with privacy, and decentralized web maybe.
Yeah, so that all came to an end in 2008 with that global financial crisis, and then shortly thereafter, Oracle bought Sun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what you did in 2008, 2009?
So the next thing I worked on was I actually got a job at IBM, in part because of my experience with Roller. They were using Roller on a product called Lotus Connections.
Okay.
And I also had some friends at IBM who worked for IBM Rational. So I got a job basically working for the CTO of Rational. I was on CTO staff, and I worked on a specification for integrating kind of IBM's ALM lifecycle software development tools. So they wanted to use basically RDF technology combined with REST to define this kind of standard API that all of their tools could implement.
Resource description framework, right? Like this semantic web.
Right. So I spent a couple of years kind of learning about RDF and semantic web and trying to apply that to kind of integrating software tools together. And that was fun. I was the specification lead for an OSLC spec that we completed. But at some point, after a couple of years at IBM, my friends from Sun had started another company called Way In. So Scott McNeely had a second startup, and got contacted by them and ended up joining Way In. And initially, when I joined, I didn't understand what the heck they were doing. Basically, what they were doing is trying to create a social network where instead of like looking at tweets or posts, you would look at a feed that has these kind of polls in it. And you would do these kind of polls about different topics. And they thought that would be interesting enough to hold people's attention. And different brands would put out polls that would, engage with their audience. And we implemented that in, it was a Java backend, MongoDB. This is my first experience with AWS Cloud. We did everything on the cloud.
Was it EC2? Plain EC2 or Fargate ECS?
It was EC2. Yeah, there was no Fargate back then. I think we also initially used a service called RightScale to help us with that.
Quite a history, RightScale.
Yeah, and then we went to, I think the whole stack was eventually in CloudFormation. We had a pretty nice setup with CloudFormation. We had CloudFormation and Jenkins, and we had a full kind of CI/CD setup at one point. So anyhow, that application, that polling technology, the initial thing that Way In tried to do wasn't very successful. We kind of pivoted to something called Twit polls. So we wanted to have polls on Twitter, and this is before Twitter supported them natively. And so what we would do is we would put out a poll, and the way people would respond is by mentioning a hashtag. So they would reply to a post, and they would mention one of the hashtags that is the vote, and then we would basically be processing the Twitter fire hose and looking for all the votes and tallying those up and giving a very nice interface. And so the idea was that brands could engage with customers by doing these polls, and then they could kind of bring them back to their page that kind of conglomerates these polls. That also was not maybe a great business idea. We tried a couple of other iterations, but eventually I decided to leave Way In.
But you worked closely with Scott McNeely, right?
I guess I wouldn't say that closely with him. I mean, I did get to meet him a number of more times.
Yeah, but it's still interesting for you, no? I mean,
it was absolutely interesting, and it was great to kind of reconnect with some of the folks that I'd worked with at Sun there at Way In.
Yeah.
So it was a very good experience. It was also my first experience with kind of a very small startup, and also an experience where everything is kind of virtual. Everything you have is like, in the cloud. The human resources system is kind of a SaaS that we were using, and everything was kind of virtual.
Scott McNeely still tweets from time to time about Sun Microsystems. Still, a huge Sun Microsystems fan, which is great, I would say, right?
Yep, I follow Scott.
Yeah, and what happens then?
Yeah, so at Way In, we initially started using MongoDB, and we kind of were dissatisfied with the way that it scaled and how we were able to manage it. We eventually switched to Cassandra. Used Cassandra, I think, for the last year that I was there. And because of my experience with Cassandra, I was able to get a job with Apache. So
Apache, this is a gateway, which was bought by Oracle, right?
That's their main thing, is API gateway and API management. But they also had a database as a service called UserGrid.
Okay.
And so UserGrid is essentially a REST API wrapped around Cassandra that makes Cassandra very easy to use, especially for mobile developers. It's like a database.
Like Firebase, almost, right?
Yeah, essentially like Firebase. And so you've got this REST API that's easy to use, easy to create collections. Everything is indexed, so you can search through your collections. There's ways to create connections between objects. And behind the scenes is Cassandra and Elasticsearch. And so that was all Java. I think some Spring, obviously Cassandra, Elasticsearch. But that was another case where we wanted to make it open source. We wanted to make sure that it was a viable open source project, so we decided to take it to Apache.
Mm-hmm.
So I took another project through the Apache incubator, and so that became Apache UserGrid, and unfortunately, it is now also in the attic.
Oh, because of you left, right?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think it's in part because Oracle bought Apogee, and Oracle already had multiple kind of database as a service offerings like Firebase, and I guess you could say Spanner and other things like that. They didn't really need to have Apache UserGrid, so they kind of wound things down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I remember career. I was at Oracle. I was in Prague, and I think it was, I don't know what it was, Geekon, but Geekon I think was sponsored by Oracle, because Oracle had and this was exactly the year when Apogee was bought by Oracle, and the Apogee CEO had a talk about Apogee at Oracle and how the transition happened from Apogee to Oracle, and this happened in Prague. And this was interesting experience. I think it was Geekon, and this was like April year. I don't remember. I think 2016 maybe. 2016, 17 is maybe too late.
Yeah, it was late 2016.
Mm-hmm. Or late. And I know it was cold and rainy, so it was either spring or autumn.
But Oracle bought Apogee, and I really didn't want to move to Mountain View.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started looking for a new job, and I ended up at CloudBees. And I was there for 5 years working at CloudBees, which was interesting because CloudBees is a company started by, well, among others, Kosuke of Jenkins fame. And I'd actually worked on the same team with him back at Sun. When I was on the Glassfish team, that was like the early days of Jenkins. I think Jenkins.
Kosuke is Kosuke is actually his real name. As also on my podcast, I had a chat with him. He's amazing. Right?
He is amazing, and back then I think Hudson was the name of it, and it was basically a server running under his desk, and it was doing the Glassfish builds back then.
Mm-hmm. And so and interesting. So you worked for CloudBees for 5 years until 2021, right?
Yeah, almost 5 years. Initially working on the enterprise version of Jenkins, which is basically Jenkins that runs on Kubernetes. So there's a manager of managers, and there's the ability to spin up build agents kind of dynamically that run on Kubernetes. Worked on that for a while, and then worked on a new category of software that we were trying to invent called software delivery management.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is you collect all this information from all the different tools that developers are using, the collaborative tools like bug tracking systems, source code control systems, build systems, and then you're able to have kind of insightful reports about things like cycle time of features being developed, or look for stale pull requests, this kind of thing. So we developed a system that kind of ingests data from all these different systems through Kafka and Flink, puts them into Postgres, and then kind of presents them through a very nice and kind of dynamic GraphQL API.
And now you're retired.
No, I'm not retired, actually. So I worked at CloudBees for 5 years, then worked for Apollo for another year, and then this
Apollo is the GraphQL client?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because of my work at CloudBees with GraphQL, I was able to get a job with Apollo, and then December, just a couple of months ago, got hit by the tech layoffs.
At Apollo?
Yeah.
Oh.
So I'm on the job market.
Very good. So how people can hire you?
What do you mean how people?
You're in the job market. So if a company would like to have Gerald on steroids or whatever, how they can find you on the internet?
They can find me at Snoop Dave on Twitter or on LinkedIn. My handle is also Snoop Dave on LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm. Why Snoop Dave?
That's like an old story. Wow. So Snoop Dave, that's like a name from the 90s, around the time that Snoop Dogg was popular.
Rapper.
Yeah. So, the story is, back when I worked at the phone company at 9X, we had internet, and I had me and my friend were on a subnet that somehow was able to intercept traffic for kind of all across the corporate network. And at one point, we were trying to debug the connection between our PCs and our Sun workstations. And we were using like promiscuous packet sniffing. So we could really see what the packets were going through our network were. And at some point, we noticed that there were some weird messages coming through the network, like the dwarf drinks the potion, or the elf hits the dragon with a sword. And we were just, what is going on our network? And we started noticing that this activity would be kind of going on all day long. And we realized that there was somebody on our network who was playing one of those multi-user dungeons.
Okay.
And so we kind of became obsessed with finding out who this person was and trying to figure out how to stop them from doing this. And so that's kind of where the name Snoop Dave came from, as I was basically snooping.
And it turned out it was the CEO of the company. Instead of creating PowerPoints, he played, some.
It turned out that it was an intern at the company.
Hey, it was a lot of fun. I'm still using Roller, and I actually started to build my own version, very very simple one, but no time to complete. Absolutely unusable for your needs. For me, it's more like the static page generator. It's quite an opposite that with the same API, but it just generates static pages, and you can store just 5 snippets which are loaded. This is what I did, and but I'm still using Roller because I have no time to finish. So, but Roller, I'm still amazed actually, and I was really completely blown away as I saw, that Sun Microsystem has a software like a portal almost, right, where the everything is running in Sun. It's a pity that you don't know how much traffic it actually happened on Roller. Do you at least know how many machines they were involved with Roller?
I am really not remembering. I think it was on the order of 3 to 6 machines.
Okay. This would be interesting. Which machines, how big they were, how many CPUs.
Yes, that's what.
So we have to create to know some more investigations here. How it runs. But one of the largest installation. I mean, back then, right? How many employees used Roller? And it should be 10,000 or more.
Yeah, I think it was at least 10,000, possibly 20,000 blogs. But I don't know how many of those were active blogs. I mean, a lot of people set up a blog and then never actually do anything with it.
But it was still scanned by Google. Someone hit them. Yeah. I mean, this was the end. It was the end. Back then, Sun was huge, and the entire attention. So I checked, the Blogger page multiple times a day. I would say this is.
Yeah, I did too. There were some very successful blogs on there that did some great work for Sun, like the Aquarium blog.
Exactly, Aquarium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And later, the Jonathan Schwartz also blogged on Blogger, right?
Yeah, that's right. I still follow him as well.
Thank you a lot. You are Snoop Dave on Twitter.
Yep. Snoop Dave on Twitter or Snoop Dave on LinkedIn.
Thank you a lot. And it was fun, to learn about Roller.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.